Hey everyone, and welcome to Generative Now. This is the show where we talk to the builders who are creating the world's most exciting AI products and companies. I am Michael Mignano, and I'm a partner at Lightspeed. And for today's episode, we have something a little bit different than normal. So I typically talk to founders on this show, people that are building AI products and companies. But for this episode, we thought it would be fun to talk to two other investors, people that are investing in AI companies like I do at Lightspeed. And so I spoke to Sarah Guo, founder and partner at Conviction, a new venture firm that's purpose-built to serve AI-native Software 3.0 companies, and Elad Gil, an investor and advisor to companies like Character.ai, Harvey.ai, Perplexity, Pika, and many, many others. They also have an AI podcast called No Priors. So we had a lot of fun in this episode, from talking about AI strategy to product to where they see the upcoming opportunities for AI companies in 2024 and beyond. So I hope you enjoy this episode with Sarah Guo and Elad Gil. Take a listen. Sarah, Elad, good to see you both. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, good to see you too.
Thanks for having us.
So I typically talk to founders, people building companies, building products, but I thought for this one, it could be fun to talk to other investors who are also investing in AI companies, kind of get your take on things, see how it compares to what I'm doing on the investing side, and thought the listeners might enjoy that. But before we do any of that, it'd be great to have you two briefly introduce yourselves. Sarah, you want to start?
Sure. I founded Conviction, an early stage specialist fund, last year, and we are focused on finding the most important software companies. And we think AI matters and is really different. We're in the early innings of revolution, how we interact with computers. So it's really fun to trade notes with you and Elad.
Thanks.
Oh, great. And I'm Elad. I've started two companies, one of which was acquired by Twitter. Worked at Google early on both mobile as well as early ML or AI systems and ads targeting. And then when my first company got bought by Twitter, ended up working on search and geo and other AI-centric product areas, as well as just general scaling of the company and M&A and things like that. I see I have a company called Color, and then I've invested in a variety of companies across both non-AI stuff like Airbnb and Stripe and things like that, as well as AI companies like Character, Perplexity, Pika, Mistral, et cetera. Harvey, a variety of companies.
Yeah, you mentioned Pika. I think one thing the three of us have in common is we are all involved with Pika. We all invested in Pika. And the other thing we all have in common is we all have podcasts. You two have a podcast as well.
Yeah. So the podcast got started when Sarah pinged me over text saying, "Hey, do you want to do a podcast together?" And I said, "Oh, sure. Sounds fun. Let's try it as long as you do most of the work." And she has been doing most of the work, but it's been an enormous amount of work overall, but it's been a lot of fun. So we've tried to really have a broad survey of sort of the area across researchers, founders, and people running big companies that are relevant.
Mike, you know much more about podcasting than either of us do, so this will amuse you. But the original thought was like, it'll be fun to have a small side project. What is the least work version of something that, would be media related? And we would just talk to people we already knew and thought were interesting. And the least work, like, oh, maybe we'll do a few episodes, so snowball a little bit.
Yeah, no work at all. So last year was obviously total insanity for investing in AI. I feel like we were having this conversation a year ago. Things would be very, very different. I'm just curious, you're both very smart. You've both been investing for a while. Did you see any of it coming? Like, again, if we were having this conversation a year ago, could you have anticipated 2023 would have been the way it was for AI investing? What surprised you?
I mean, we made a pretty long-term bet on this from the fund perspective. And we launched Conviction in October of 2022. And then ChatGPT, the moment, happened in November. So I definitely did not predict the consumer reaction to it. And I thought it would happen a little more slowly. But you could see, and Elad should speak to this in some of the products and companies he's worked on as well, you could see scaling models coming into effect. You could see transformers becoming more and more effective, like decades-long open problems being solved. And that was all very exciting. I thought it was going to be more of like a slow roll, and I'd have a little more time to put the fund together, just like look at companies, set up a new company. But I think the acceleration in capabilities was surprised everybody.
Yeah, I worked on the ML and AI world for, or I've been working on it for a long time, right? When I was at Google, like almost 20 years ago, I was working on early ML systems and sort of the pre-deep learning days, and then deep learning happened, and I invested in a bunch of companies for like a decade, and roughly none of those companies worked. As you know, there's a lot of incumbent stuff that worked, and there was a handful of things that where they used AI as a way that was ancillary to the company itself, or that was enabling, but that ended up building big companies like Samsara or Anduril or things like that I backed in some cases in the earliest days of those companies. But then for me, at least, the big transition was GPT-3 because it was such a big step up from GPT-2. It's actually went on the Andreessen podcast back in whenever GPT-3 came out, and we talked about it because I thought it was so excited. I actually called them and pitched them and said, we ended up kind of across a few different themes with Chris Dixon and this guy, Seth Combar, talking about crypto and AI and a few other things that became sort of a mix. But, when 3.5 came out, it was even a bigger step function. And that's when I just started funding a lot of things and reaching out to researchers. And, some people reached out to me, like Noam from Character pinged me because I'd known him for a while and said he wanted to start something. And Arvin from Perplexity reached out, and we started hanging out and just chatting about potential things to build. And so I just think, for a short period of time, there was sort of this clear giant step function in technology. And very few people were actually paying attention. And it was almost like this golden era of like amazing people, interesting ideas, and just nobody cared. And it was very exciting. Sarah got involved in that time too, and, a variety of other folks. But I think a lot of people kind of came in the ChatGPT era.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, Sarah, you talked about how like you could almost see this stuff coming through the way things were scaling. You knew there was going to be a moment. You didn't know the moment would be during ChatGPT. Where do you both, as you look forward now, it almost feels like we're in sort of like the middle part of the S curve. Like, does it plateau out anytime soon, or are we on just like a straight shot up for the foreseeable future?
I don't want to like echo the crypto people too much, but it sure feels like we're really early, right? And we're going to get stacked capability here. It's interesting. So much of investing is timing, right? A little early and a little late is both okay. And a little late is okay if you are very, very different and just clever on a technology transition. But I think a lot even more so than me, I think part of the trick in investing is you have to be in market doing enough experimentation, either as a founder or as an investor, to like have some understanding of like how far away we are. And so I think, part of my experience was at Greylock, we invested in, I was there for a decade. We invested in some last generation machine learning companies that were a little too early. And some of the most interesting founders today, they've been working on it for a long time, actually, right? So you both know Lucas from Weights and Biases, and like he tried once and he was too early and nothing worked. And suddenly like you feel it when everything begins to work. And so for me, like I invested in Base 10 in about 3 years ago now, 3.5 years ago. And like that really started working this year. We were investors in Inflection, it was a pretty well-named company, right? But it was one of the first, like, I guess, aggressive bets in foundation model companies besides OpenAI. And it's not, I think you can make some arguments about it getting harder to push the state of the art in large language models from a just cost of scale perspective or obviousness of where the next set of data is going to come from. But the compounding effect of like going from a very small group of people paying attention to a huge ecosystem being really excited about the innovation and funding it, I think it compounds from here. I think we're pretty early.
What do you think, Elad?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for growth. And I think ChatGPT was kind of the starting gun for most people, including, there's basically no real enterprise adoption so far. So that's going to be a big wave. In general, I think about it as 5 waves of human capital that have come through and will come through. The first wave was just like AI native builders who were working on LLMs and or foundation models and wanted to do apps. And so that's why you had Noam start Character. He's one of the authors on the original Transformer paper. The adept folks were Arvin from Perplexity, et cetera. These were all people working at Google or OpenAI, basically, or in some cases, Facebook. The second wave was a mix of, I call it like nerds, and I include myself in that category, right? It's like the hardcore dev and infra people, and some of them started the companies earlier, like Sarah mentioned around Base 10, but some things were also more recent, like Together, or some of the other companies that are really now providing part of the stack for these models. And we had an infra wave, and that's still happening. And there's tooling like what Brain Trust is doing now and others, The third wave, I think, is going to be B2B apps. And I think a lot of the people who, heard about ChatGPT 13 months ago or whenever it was, probably quit their jobs 6 months ago. And then they took a couple of months to figure shit out, and now they're starting things. And so I think we'll see an app wave on the B2B side. And I think consumer is probably a little bit behind that. And then I think the fifth wave will be enterprise in terms of actual adoption. And so I just view it as subsequent waves of people who are staggered in time relative to a mix of technical competency, focus, product versus engineering thinking, et cetera. And obviously there's people who are kind of in between, right? Like the Harvey team would be a good example of that. But in general, I think that's how we're going to see this evolve.
I have so many directions I want to take this in. You're both saying a number of things I wanted to touch on. Just to go back a little bit before I sort of break off from some of those questions. Sarah, you talked about, it's becoming somewhat predictable about where the next foundation model opportunities will be based on the data sets. I think that's how I understand what you said earlier. Do you both feel like the opportunity for large models at this point is kind of baked? Like, it felt like 2023, there were all these huge rounds, whether it be, Anthropic or Inflection or, these huge OpenAI rounds. Is that opportunity, is the window for that opportunity pretty much closed for startups at this point? And if so, and maybe you just answered this a lot, where do we see most of the dollars going in 2024?
It's really interesting because so much of venture, there's so much capital that comes behind having any kind of precedent. Yeah. But some of the most interesting companies are really first of their kind companies. And so I think this is really unpredictable. And the reason I bring up venture following precedent is there were not a lot of people trying to fund foundation model companies as a category until it became very broadly known how rapidly ChatGPT revenue was growing and the excitement around it, right? And then I'd say, Elad and I are both investors in Mistral, and I think it's a first of its kind company in terms of a open source play. But until they delivered their first really example model and then mixture of experts model, I don't think people believe there were a lot of very smart people at the cutting edge and application builders that dismiss small models in terms of capability and usefulness, right? And so I am not a researcher, but I think it is very, very, it will cost in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars from here to continue scaling language model training at the state-of-the-art level if there are no new breakthroughs. That being said, a lot more people are working creatively on efficiency of training than used to. And so, Jensen's laws, scaling laws, I think are in some ways on our side. For the same scale, compute is getting cheaper. And for the same capability, the cost to train is going down. And there's just much more in the open source world that you can start with, Mistral and others. And I think there are really interesting opportunities around models in different modalities or for different applications.
Yeah, and maybe Pika. Yeah, sorry to cut you off.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That was going to be my first example of, video as a domain is a very different area. Biotech, clinical medicine, science. I think there are different areas. Maybe this is mimetic now and it'll be difficult from an investing dynamics perspective, but I think there's a lot that may still happen that's interesting. I actually think most of our fund is going to be application oriented, but we're already investors in some of these models. And I think people like to call the end of these wars far too early.
Yeah. What do you think, Elad? And how does this connect to maybe what you were saying with the app wave? Is the next wave the app wave? Or do you agree with Sarah that there are just going to be new opportunities and new research that's going to lead to breakthroughs for new types of model companies to be built?
I definitely think there's going to be new type of model companies. I mean, I think, if you look at the set of models, there's the language models, there's voice, so text to speech, speech to text, things like that. There's diffusion models for image, video, and audio. There's
code.
There's code.
Yeah.
And then to Sarah's point, there's biology, there's physics, there's material sciences, there's math, there's all sorts of stuff. And some of these things will just be absorbed by general purpose models. And some of them need to be specialized both in terms of training sets, but also actually architecture, right? Like AlphaFold isn't just a transformer-based model, it's kind of a mix, although they've also done quite a bit, some interesting things with transformers. So I think fundamentally we're going to see a dispersion of certain model types, particularly against science, robotics, medicine, et cetera. And so I feel like there's two ways to interpret your question. That stuff will definitely happen. And then separate from that, there'll be different aspects of large language models, or I should say language models, right? Or multimodal models. And there'll be this sort of matrix of performance against generalizability and intelligence. And there'll be different companies in different squares in that matrix. From a sheer dollar perspective, most of the funding from a dollar basis perspective will probably go to late stage model companies simply because they're the most capital intensive.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of number of companies, my anticipation is we're going to see a lot more tooling and app companies than foundation model companies next year. So it comes down to whether you're talking about a number basis or a dollar basis.
Yeah, makes sense. And what does the app wave look like? Are we talking about, apps as we traditionally think about them, whether they be, desktop applications, mobile applications, or are we even talking about, hey, GPTs? Like GPTs is going to be like this whole new investable area of companies and products?
Yeah, I think there's B2B and there's consumer. On the B2B side, what I and sort of my now small nation team have done is we've taken all of services and segmented it by what are the areas that can actually be addressable by generative AI. And we just looked at how much payroll there is in a given industry vertical. So for example, if you look at entire software spend, I'm working on a blog post on this right now, right? It's $500 billion in software spend in the US. It's $3.5 trillion in services, headcount payroll for things that we think are addressable by generative AI. So if even like 5 or 10% of that gets converted into SaaS, you've roughly reproduced the entire software world in terms of market size and market cap. And so that's things like Hardby and legal. There's probably 2 or 3 other legal companies to build. There's a variety of different services. And I think each different increment of GPT level models will open up new services markets. So GPT-4 enabled legal when GPT-3 couldn't do it. Maybe GPT-5 opens up a whole other area and GPT-6 a different area and GPT-7 a different area, right? So I think we're going to be climbing this ladder of capability relative to markets that are able or accessible or open for startups. Separate from that, there's consumer stuff. And David on my team ran a experiment this last quarter where we had like a dozen Stanford students building consumer apps for fun. And there was no real like financial arrangement or anything. It was just like, let's do something fun and I'll meet with everybody every week and we'll just talk about like what they're building and like insights or ideas or people to meet or whatever. And so we ended up with like half a dozen different apps at demo day. And there was some really interesting, intriguing thinking around like, what do you do for consumer applications and generative AI? And I think that's very underdone in the AI world. Like there's very little emphasis on consumer in general in the startup world anymore. It's almost like the consumer founders aged out. They're all in their 30s now. They're ancient. Yeah. But I think there's like a lot of room to do really interesting things for social, consumer, et cetera.
So I agree with you. And I think, it's almost like there has been a playbook over the past 5 to 10 years for doing SaaS companies, right? And consumer is obviously a lot harder to pull off. But if you think about like what I would say are probably the 2 biggest success stories of companies in AI right now, and Sarah and I were talking a little bit about this yesterday, it feels like it's OpenAI, which, it's rumored that most of that 1.6 billion in revenue is coming from the consumer side. And I would argue it's also Midjourney, right? Which is doing, reported hundreds of millions in revenue. Also, I would say that's a consumer company. Like, what does that tell us about the opportunity for AI companies? Maybe it actually is in consumer right now. And also is the notion that there's going to be an enterprise company that powers AI for the rest of the industry, maybe as the way that people have thought about OpenAI, maybe a lot more challenging. How do you both think about that?
A lens I have about like why, building more software is so interesting and important is that it democratizes capabilities. And that is not just AI, right? Like you said like there's been a playbook for SaaS. The SaaS playbook has changed, right?
Yeah.
I got to live through a few generations of it at Greylock, and like I think Elad and I are also both investors in Figma. Figma was a sort of first of its kind company, but it was also part of a generation of companies that grew by the now like coveted playbook, if you can call that, that's pretty unique to figure out for each company, of getting individual contributors inside a large enterprise to adopt a new workflow that is collaborative. I think if it's that, or it's Canva, or if it's any other productivity company, like defined really broadly, that could be different types of writing, graphic and user experience design, like video production, that could be Pika or something like HeyGen, application building and engineering, different types of small business enablement. I think that's going to be a really big category. And I think that, you know, somewhat related to Elad's layout of 5 generations of human capital, the prosumer stuff I actually think is going to grow pretty quickly over this next period. And the premise of the AI wave of this is you're just doing things with software that you used to pay someone for
Right.
because you can afford to now. And it opens up entirely new markets of, you know, things you used to, for example, outsource to an agency. And you'll have much more like direct control or manipulability. And I think that's really exciting as a sector of software. In terms of serving the enterprise, I think there's going to be a lot of creativity on figuring out like what the, be it end-to-end or new workflows of the application level companies that serve the enterprise. It just takes them longer to adopt. But there is a very strong understanding and mandate, especially from like more tech savvy or founder driven companies, that they should invest. And so I think there is a huge opportunity now for tools. Like there's this analogy that people use that's like alien technology left here, magic. Normally that type of analogy just annoys the heck out of me because it's like very imprecise. But in this case, it's actually like somewhat apt. Because we have this technology that we cannot explain very well. We can explain mechanically, but for any given input or you know what data is driving a particular generation, we have a lot of work to do to be able to introspect and manipulate and scale these models. Like there's going to be an entirely new stack around this new primitive that large enterprises really think is very important. And so I know Lightspeed has been an investor here, but there's been so much talk from investors over a 5+ year period about the modern data stack. And I think the modern AI stack is actually much more interesting because it's feeding all these net new applications. And so I think that's probably the nearest term, like enterprise opportunity. So you have services like Free Play and Brain Trust and such, but I think the more workflow-oriented business user applications are going to be a step behind.
Let's get a little bit into this. You talked about prosumer, you talked about SMB a lot. I think it's really smart that you're looking at payroll by given industry. That makes me think you're kind of viewing AI almost as a resource, like you would capital or people. And if you imagine that AI basically automates or does what people previously could, and you think about this prosumer SMB opportunity, you could see these small businesses getting very, very big and very, very successful without having to employ that many people. You could also see new startups that are building businesses and products specifically for SMBs. Which of those two do you think there's greater opportunity? Small companies that are leveraging AI to do really big things, or tools and products and services that are enabling small companies to do really big things?
You know, if I had to guess, and I'm probably going to guess wrong, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Midjourney's revenue is actually like medium companies or, there'll be some small businesses where it's used as like a creative tool inside. But I do think there's more, it's kind of more of a B2B tool. And I don't mean like big enterprise by that. I just mean, I don't think that I wouldn't be surprised if there's a creator class that does a lot of stuff on it. But then like much or most of the revenue is like the person who needs to put simple images together for a slide in a company of whatever size. This is sort of the prosumer comment. So I just kind of don't want to overstate some of these things. I think the whole AI is going to make every company one person and we're going to rebuild every app using AI instantly and all this stuff. I think that kind of stuff is many years away. And so I do think we can make certain things dramatically more effective and efficient, but you still need human in the loop for most things that this technology helps with. Like Harvey is a fantastic legal tool. It's not going to obviate the legal profession next year, but it's going to be an amazing tool for legal professionals. And maybe over time, the way you think about the size of the team you need in order to serve clients well may shrink over time, right? But I think these things will take time to really propagate. And in its extreme, you could imagine, okay, there's just going to be like agents driving software development. And why do you even need the founder if the things get smart enough, right? I always feel like humans always cast a very central role for themselves forever. And they're like, oh yeah, I can do everything except for my job.
Right.
And so, at some point that gets a little bit ridiculous, but.
Yeah. I'm an investor in this company called Seek. And they're trying to do automation of a bunch of the data analytics job. And so, how do you ask a question in natural language of some structured data source in your company? And that could be Snowflake or warehouse or database and get the right answer back, which is not just a natural language to SQL problem, but a much more complex one. And it's really interesting, like where they're getting the most traction. There's some uptake amongst smaller and larger customers, but there is definitely a segment of the, let's say like analyst audience that does not like this, right? They're resistant to the idea of automation and over a very small training period, we're like, oh, we can do 70% of this, 80% of it, but that may not be that compelling to them. It might be very compelling to their boss, right? And so I think a part of it is also where in the organization you are selling to, what the incentives are within that organization. And SMBs are interesting because they often don't want to do a bunch of the other functions, right? They love some part of their business and not necessarily like the marketing or the asset creation or anything else. And so it makes that sale much simpler. But I do think we will, I do think like economics and the democratization of capability wins out over the end. To Elad's point of taking it to the extreme, if you take one step back from that, it is interesting to see like this year, like 2023 and the end of 2022 was certainly a first time in the last like decade and a half I've seen people so ambitious to build companies efficiently in terms of headcount. Like we just backed a repeat entrepreneur who is trying to figure out how few people he needs to get to 100 million of ARR. That's just a very different from like 2019 mentality.
Totally.
Yeah, I think people just forgot, right? Because if you actually look at the history of tech, it's largely been capital efficient businesses, right? Microsoft was profitable and it's bootstrapped and it took in a round of funding right before the IPO because Bill Gates wanted a friend of his on the board, right, from a venture fund. And then you go into the 80s and Dell was bootstrapped and they took a round right before the IPO, but they didn't need the cash. And then you go into the 90s and Yahoo never touched $1 of venture capital at raise. Same with eBay. Google was incredibly capital efficient early on. And then you go into the 2000s and Instagram was 12 people and it was bought. And YouTube was like 25 people or something, 30 people, whatever it was. And so I just feel like people forgot that capital efficient businesses are often the best businesses because capital efficiency is a reflection of the willingness of people to really pay up relative to sort of human capital leverage inside of a company, right? The ratio of revenue per person is quite high. Or you have enormous pricing power. So I just think everybody forgot that and raised tons of money. And, the metric of progress was valuation versus anything else. And I think capital efficient businesses traditionally have done very well. And there's counterexamples to that. But I think in both directions, but I think in general, people just forgot about that. And I don't think it's an AI wave thing. I think it's just the AI founders that I've seen and have been working with are just more hardcore in general. They're driven, they're really smart. In some cases, they've been working in this area for years and years and years, and this is their dream come true. And they work nonstop. And I feel like that's just a return to Silicon Valley as it used to be versus like something not new.
But it does feel like AI can contribute, right? And accelerate this and like bring the ratio
absolutely.
Up.
But when people say, Copilot, like you have Copilot or ChatGPT, makes 10 engineering person team one engineer. You're like, no, it doesn't.
No,
like, what are you talking about, right? Have you ever actually tried the thing? Like, what are you talking? And you hear this on podcasts all the time, right? Around, pundits kind of talking stuff like this. You're just like, that's just completely false. Unless maybe your engineers are so bad that that's true. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think separate from that, there's the SMB question. And in general, people who run SMBs, if it's a true SMB, like a 5-person company, they're really busy. And they're only going to buy like 3 or 4 things that they absolutely need to run their business. They're going to have payroll. They're going to have healthcare or other benefits. They're going to pay taxes, which is why Intuit exists, right? It's like Rippling, it's Intuit, it's Gusto, it's they need HubSpot because they need to market, or they need some form of CRM. There aren't that many things that SMB buy, and therefore SMB tends to be an awful market for most things, right? And it's possible there may be some AI SMB centric things, but I think the current leverage on human capital is a bit overstated, although I think that's going to expand as we hit different levels of GPT 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. But also I think there are some verticals where it's really going to eat away at the vertical faster than we all anticipate. And Midjourney is a great example of that, where I actually think it's displacing people faster than you would have guessed for certain types of jobs, as well as expanding the market. And I think there's going to be a handful of those things that hit with each successive wave of capabilities, either creative fusion models or transformer-based models. But I think today it's kind of overstated for other things like code gen.
Changing it up a little bit, we've talked about Midjourney a little bit, OpenAI. We all mentioned Pika a little bit. All of these companies are sort of these like full stack AI companies in that they have products and then they also have their own foundation models. Is this kind of the silver bullet for an AI company right now, and that you have basically the whole thing? Is it the most defensible way to build an AI company right now? Or are these companies not defensible? Does it not matter that they have their own model and their own product in the same stack?
I think when you talk to most researchers today, there begins to be a blurry line between fine tuning on a sufficiently large amount of unique data and pre-training, right? Assuming you're starting from some open source base model that is useful and significant, which was not really available before 9 months ago. And so I think there will be companies of that form built, and there are increasingly like good technical teams doing this in particular domains. So I think like, some of the companies you mentioned, like they're not language models, right? They're video models, they're image models. They work in a different domain. So we're just like, these things are apples and oranges. And so there wasn't a different option. But I think that there will be application level companies that start from some base model that are defensible in different ways, right? Like I think this question is a good one about defensibility in AI applications, because it's just like, new market dynamics. But if you asked like what makes a SaaS company defensible a few years ago, like, there's one version of this, if you're just pure nerd about it, where you're like, well, I run Postgres in the cloud, and then I got like CRUD, on my objects that look like kind of CRM-y objects. And like that describes a lot of companies that are pretty valuable. And so all of the things that like were valuable for SaaS companies before, understanding your customer workflows and then like giving them some real ROI on something they were trying to do, and actually being able to do distribution and go to market to those customers, like they remain really hard and really valuable. And I think the opportunity to be creative about rethinking those workflows is really interesting, and the thing that like threatens incumbents, at least when talking to the incumbent founders. But interesting what you guys think here too.
Yeah, what do you think, Elad?
I think the first wave of founders were all researchers who wanted to build their own models for everything, including companies that didn't need them. And so I think that first wave, every company raised like 20, 30, 40, $50 million. And half of those companies, I think, won't make it, in part because they focused on model building instead of customers. So they should have been focused on customers. And there's others who integrated it well, like a Pika or I think when OpenAI launched ChatGPT, nobody thought it was going to be that big, including the OpenAI team. And
low-key research preview.
Yeah, it was a research preview that just took off like crazy, right? Because it was such an amazing thing. One of the reasons I backed Character was because they had an internal version of that at Google, besides just being amazing, right? which was Minna. And, it was just so compelling to anybody that you talked to interacted with. I don't know if you remember, there was like engineer Google who thought that the chatbot was sentient, right? Because it's so interesting and compelling. And that was basically ChatGPT in some sense. So I do think the first wave of people will build their own models. I think there'll be a subset of people that will continue to do so. Diffusion models are dramatically cheaper to train and build than these very large language models. And so I do think on the image, video, and audio side, we may continue to see that as a trend because you may differentiate on that. You may start with stable diffusion and then fine tune it and then decide you're just going to train your own model over time. That's kind of the evolution you see a lot of these teams do. And then for the large language model, eventually you'll have a war between generalizability, scale, and performance. And people will make different trade-offs along those curves. And in some cases, that'll mean I'm just going to use GPT-6 because it gives me really strong sort of logic capabilities and generalizable knowledge and capabilities to do things. And in some cases, you say, I just need this small performant thing that I'm just going to add some RAG to or whatever and just go, And so I think it's going to be a mix. And I think a lot of the application level companies won't need their own bespoke bottoms up built model. And then again, separate from them, there's robotics and science and different aspects of science and physics and materials. And there you'll probably see more vertically integrated companies simply because of the domain that they're in, and there may not be good capabilities and it may be a big differentiator. So I think it's going to fragment.
Yeah, it almost seems like every week, there's a new model that puts out their benchmarks and says, hey, we're better than every other model, right? And then a week later, you're seeing the same thing from another company. To me, that almost feels like, everything is sort of converging and we're experiencing sort of a commodification of this technology. And thus, the most important thing, perhaps as it's always been, will be, customer adoption, retention, sort of back to basics about what makes for a great product. Is that how you two think about it?
I'd start with maybe a minor part of what you just described, which are the benchmarks are a weak proxy for how these things do in real world use cases, right? And so yes, Demi and Chenlin at Pika, well, how do you know the model's better? It's a very complicated answer. And it's not like this academic benchmark, right? The way we do testing at HeyGen with enough scale is user testing, right? What do people want when we deliver new versions of the model? I think in code, instead of the academic benchmarks, which are competitive programming and human eval is handcrafted Python data set from one guy, right? Not to trivialize that work, but that doesn't represent, can I write code that executes in general production environments? And I think the benchmark performance is interesting, but still super academic research oriented and overstates sort of the understanding that most people have of how different these models are in behavior. And so I think going back to part of our conversation earlier, I don't think we're going to end up in a fully monolithic world anytime soon. And people still want extremely different capabilities with very different data sets, right? Can you get agents to work and take actions in software? Can you make a robot arm that does pick and pack robustly? Just to take two things that are not fully reliable today. It is, you can shape you can shape part of it to be a next token prediction problem, but it's not at all clear that gets us to the promised land. And so I think there's still lots of room for value at that layer. But then if you look at text and structured data as a form of text, as a mostly enterprise investor, that is an area where the core LLMs are going to be very productive. And I think we're still really just in the early exploit phase of it. And so I don't know that because people have access to slightly better models from a benchmark perspective, that you won't see application level teams get things to work in real world environments in dramatically different performance levels. They do need to figure out how to communicate that to the customer.
Yeah, totally. That makes a lot of sense. They have to be able to convey the actual value of the different models. I think all of this assumes that, chatting in a text interface is the way that people want to experience this next wave of applications. And I could see that happening. ChatGPT has gotten very, very large. On the other hand, I could say that, the history of computing suggests that people don't want to just interact with a chat interface, right? That's why the GUI exists, right? That's why we tap on buttons with our fingers and our mice, right? What do you two think about that? Like, do you think that chatting with an interface can serve as a sufficient enough platform for, a whole new crop of applications to exist? Sarah, what do you think?
I think there's existence proof of this already, right? There's a lot of aggregate revenue in the AI girlfriend apps, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, can chat be a compelling interface for an application? World says yes. Is that going to lead to an operating system? I can see both. I can see both sides of this argument, right? I think it is unlikely to be chat only. I think if we see a new one, it'll be multimodal. The bull case argument is, this is the most natural interface. Everybody understands how to use it. We didn't understand intent. We could not have our computers understand intent before. And there will be a killer general consumer application, not like everything, but something that will be the first app. And maybe it's something productivity related or search related with different UX. And it requires new hardware management and new resources. And then we go from that to a platform. That's kind of the bull case. I don't know if I believe it yet, but I can see why the model providers or the founders want it to be true. And part of it is if you own the hardware and you own the operating system, you are not subject to dealing with the mess that is Android compatibility or the privacy and security constraints of Apple, including in delivering experiences that consumers might actually want, right? Versus siloed apps and being able to offer all your data to all your relevant data to a particular application. I'm very open-minded. I'll believe it when I see it, but I don't think it will be chat only.
Yeah, multimodal. What do you think, Elad? Do you think chat can be the interface for the next wave of applications and products and companies?
I think there'll be a series of interfaces. I think chat actually works for a bunch of stuff. I think there'll be forms of multimodality. I think GPTV is under discussed as a really interesting API/product where you can take images and OCR them or understand the context of the image and then use them in different ways. And so I think that's really powerful for all sorts of enterprise application, defense applications, architecture, chip design. It can be used in all sorts of really interesting ways. And so I do think there's other things that matter. But I think fundamentally, there are some things that just work right now. And usually people will modify those and change those and iterate on them and come up with completely different paradigms. But I do think it's something that people do naturally and that they like. And, conversational interactions actually work really well for much of what you do as a person. That's how you interact with friends and family and others. And, there's no reason to assume that you'd want to not do that with a machine, although there's other things that you do with the machine as well. So, again, in the extreme, you'd probably assume that a lot of these interactions online collapse into agents acting on your behalf. And so eventually you're not really that involved in many interactions, right? It's sort of the extreme of a couple of years from now or 10 years from now, whenever it is, where you have agents representing corporations and governments and people in different, ways. And then you end up with more programmatic interactions across agents versus you having to interact that much with an interface. So I think these things will evolve, and it really comes down to what are the underlying technology capabilities. And if you remember in the 90s, people came out with the first PDAs, the personal whatever devices. It was
of course,
the proto smartphones, and they kept trying to do handwriting recognition. Yeah, because they thought people would write everything, right? And of course, now we just type everything, right? But people thought, oh no, people don't like typing, which everybody was doing, and instead we need to write everything. Right. And then they came up with a special language called graffiti, where you learn to write the L a certain way and the R a certain way. Right. The machines weren't smart enough to understand arbitrary writing, which now they can do. And that was really dumb in some sense. It was lauded as this brilliant breakthrough in how you think about human machine interface. But of course, that isn't used at all now. Right. And so I think there's a lot of fake hearings where people kind of overthink this stuff. Typing works really well and speaking works pretty well.
I do think that part of the skepticism that's often common here is like, I think people conflate like, is it a good interface for the user and is it possible? Right. And if we talk about like a very specific example, just take like sales reps and CRM, right? Everyone hates updating their CRM workflow. And if you wanted to rethink that, updating their CRM records, right? Like Friday by 4 p.m. before my pipeline meeting, I must do this. And it's a chore. And if you think about that operational toil and making it easier, like if you ask people, do you want to do it in fewer clicks? Like they're going to say yes. And so I think like to sort of picture a future where your software had more intent understanding and guessed the next action you were going to take all the time. It's not just the text trigger of Mike saying, please update, my company record. It's where you were and what your calendar says and what that meeting, the actual content of that meeting and what does update mean. But if it happened magically and you could just tell your computer to do things or an application to do things, like there's a really big question of whether this works, but it's kind of unquestionable that's easier. And so I think when people say like chat's a dumb interface, I do think chat without other data sources and assuming you have no multimodality is unlikely. But I think what they're really saying is like a command line without a man page that doesn't work the way Alexa did in like, the 7 years ago, like, yeah, that was dumb. It wasn't a really compelling interface.
Yeah, it's super interesting. Like, I can't really see myself, I know there's been examples of GPTs and plugins and things where, you book travel or you buy something. Personally, I can't really see myself booking a trip to Italy through a chat interface. But I think to both of your points, if there was an agent that just knew my preferences and knew what I wanted to do and then could just go do it for me, that I think that's a future I could see happening. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And it feels like that is hopefully a world in which we're headed. What are you about to say?
But how do you
Sarah?
communicate with a travel agent?
It's a good point.
The way you communicate preferences with a travel agent is kind of text. Or maybe if you're like really expressive, a mood board, but seems solvable.
Yeah. Almost everything that we do is we call people for certain things. And, it's interesting. If you're interacting with an executive, their minions will write these really long emails and then the exec will call and say like 3 sentences, right? Because they don't want to respond in detail and it's way easier to talk about certain things. And then similarly, there are some times where like text makes a lot of sense. And so I just think it's kind of like the midwit meme. People make all this stuff super complicated. And like often it just boils down to like, what's a dumb thing people already do for specific use cases. And that's probably what they'll do in the future.
And we make humans do many things, including call people, where it's not a particularly intelligent communication, right? And so I think calls and chat, if you can break it down into the use cases, is actually pretty interesting as a AI-enabled capability. We are about to launch applications for our next batch of our accelerator for AI companies Embed. And, we've gotten people doing early applications. And I think we've seen like 3 different companies in this area, all of who have traction, like in the last 2 weeks. And so I think there's demand for automation of some of these types of communication.
Yeah. And I think per your point, Sarah, like this experience, if it's multimodal, can be very, very powerful, right? Like the travel agent example. Yes. I could probably book a trip just by talking to somebody, but I probably want to see what they're about to book for me, right? Or I probably want to, I don't know, look at some of the nearby, sites I can go check out. And obviously I need to actually look at that stuff. So that's really, really interesting. Speaking of interfaces, we are all of a sudden seeing a lot of hardware products, right? Hardware and AI. How are you both thinking about this? Do you feel like there will be new hardware products that emerge as a result of AI? Or do you think that there are going to be new experiences on existing hardware that could not happen without AI, or both of those things? How are you looking at the combination of AI and hardware moving forward?
Yeah. I've been investing in this area for a long time. So like Samsara, as an example of that, they're a fleet management company that's now public that has in cab like hardware for fleets, or I've been involved with Anduril since its earliest days, and that's defense hardware plus AI or machine vision and machine learning. Square was basically initially a hardware device, right? So when I invested in Square, they still had those little things that connect to your phone for taking the credit card. So I think in some cases it's a real enabler, and it's like a powerful way to gain capabilities, particularly if you're interacting in the physical world, which is what Samsara and Anduril do. In the absence of that, I think a lot of the, for example, consumer applications will largely collapse into the existing platforms. And there undoubtedly will be some counterexample, right? And you also see applications where people use, that Oura Ring for sleep. And it's not necessarily just completely built into your iPhone or Android device. There's versions of it that are. But I think you really need a brand new capability set versus just saying, I'm going to do this other thing better. And so in the short run, I think it's really cool experiments, and I'm excited to see where people take it. But I think a lot of the early iteration will actually end up being on the devices themselves. And standalone devices are going to be less performant unless they serve a very specific physical purpose, like what Anduril or Samsara or Square or some of these other folks did.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And, I think it especially makes sense given that the OSs and the existing players, they keep a lot of these capabilities kind of locked down, right? Like it's not easy to do things with Siri on iOS, right? It's not super easy to tap into basically have the AirPods on 24/7 or something like that.
I don't know if you remember this. There was actually an era where people said that there would be AirPod companies.
Totally.
And so there's all these businesses being built around AirPods, right? So it's kind of fascinating.
But it was hard to do.
See. It's hard to do. And also the question is, what's the real functionality gain, and what are you, generating off of it and all the rest? And so I just think like some of these things are also sometimes mimetic. Yeah. Sometimes mimetic startups end up being very large. Like when Instagram started, there was like 24 different photo app uploading companies, and they really nailed it. But then there's often mimetic companies where nothing comes out of it, or mimetic waves. And so I kind of wonder if a subset of these things are just these mimetic waves that unfortunately won't necessarily translate. Although they may plant really interesting ideas for the future. Back to the mobile example we discussed, many of the ideas of what mobile phones would actually do were developed in the 90s. We just didn't have the capability to actually do it. And this feels to me like in some cases, perhaps overlapping.
So I guess, Sarah, if you agree with that, I guess then what do we think the potential new experiences on existing hardware platforms might look like? I think of Uber you could have apps on an iPhone, but Uber could not have existed without the GPS, right? Or, Instagram's another great example of an app that only could have existed because of the camera. Are we going to see new types of apps on existing platforms that only could exist because of AI? And what could those be?
I think the emergence of these is like both guaranteed and like really difficult to predict in the specific, right? I think there are going to be different versions of exactly what I said, where the workflow is kind of hard to picture because people don't believe in the technology because they've seen a version of it that doesn't work, right? In the CRM example. And you can imagine, like, for example, action taking that is cross application on your device, but, those commands don't work today. In terms of like Elad's point of view, like another framing I have here is, should there be new hardware because it's for the user? Like there's some application, or is it because someone wants to train the model with the data from the device, right? Because the latter is not an answer. Like it's not a reason anybody's going to buy the device.
Right.
And so like if you're doing something new, like do you actually need new hardware? Maybe, right? And obviously if you give people like new hardware capabilities, then you're going to get new applications if you already have the distribution. But if we're just talking chicken and egg on the killer application, yeah, I can imagine just to like make explicit, I think what you were implying, like battery management, different sensors, different permissions management, contextual intelligence that enables these better experiences is the
like
biggest.
The glasses.
Yeah, it could be glasses. It could be always listening. It could be anything that is like passive image and audio output, or just data from your different web services, and like being able to like reach that in some new or existing form factor. But I think that's the biggest argument for it. And the question is just like, can you do that in an application? Where does the compute happen? Like, will the ecosystems permit it? It's complicated today.
I'll throw out two other examples. I think robotics is one of those areas that's becoming increasingly interesting. There's been a series of research papers that have come out even over the last like 4 to 6 weeks that I think are kind of fascinating there in terms of moving more and more into like more standard deep learning world for this stuff. And then the other area obviously is self-driving. And, that's just a form of, again, robotics and hardware and everything else. And so I do think there are these big areas that will be increasingly tractable as we apply some aspects of foundation models to some of these domains in the physical world and have specialized hardware for them. But it isn't that, consumer hardware device that seems to be on trend right now.
Yeah. Let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, Web3. There have been a number of people coming out recently and companies being started and launched that is basically saying one of the killer applications of Web3 is actually going to have a lot to do with AI and content authenticity. I think Fred Wilson even wrote something about this. Scott Belsky has talked a little bit about this. If we have companies and models from companies like Pika and Midjourney and, name your product that generates some form of media, and it's all trained on some other form of original media, at some point we will need a way to track the authenticity or the origin of this stuff to enable an equitable right structure. Web3 could be the way that is done. How do you both think about that? And what are you thinking about the opportunities for Web3 and AI?
I think a couple of the concepts you mentioned are classic application areas, right? Identity, provenance.
Yep.
I think the distance between we are going to have creators or existing enterprises that own IP use crypto technologies to prove provenance is pretty far from a usability perspective. But I think from a technical perspective, it seems obvious as one of the solutions that is possible. I think in the short term, you're just going to get declarations from companies that have rights agreements and give creators certain commitments. Use this as a way to differentiate their offerings.
What do you think, Elad?
Yeah, I've long thought that there'll be some blockchain resident form of identity that'll be used potentially for both the ascertainment of origin of content, but also specifically for credentials for agents. And so if an agent is representing you, how do you know that it's actually representing a specific individual? And can it partially reveal data or aspects of that person cryptographically in ways that are secure? So, that may be your healthcare data, that may be aspects of who you are or other things. So yeah, it's an area I've been interested in for a while. We actually had Ilya, the co-founder of New York, who also was the last author on the Transformer paper on our podcast. And I also did a fireside with him in Canada. I think a lot of these concepts are really interesting areas that seem like to evolve over time. And it's a big question of time frame. I think the technology is there for the identity, not necessarily for the agents, right? From a provenance perspective, the content stuff, I think it's a little bit complicated because, say, for example, you have an enormous amount of derivative art on the internet already for Van Gogh.
Yep.
To say that you actually remove the original Van Goghs from your corpus of data that you train on, you'd still have enough signal in the style of Van Gogh that it doesn't matter.
That's right.
And those works are all in the clear from a copyright perspective, right? Or from a usage perspective. And so I also think there's things like that people don't really discuss enough in terms of provenance and, what actually exists and what is a training set, because it's possible you could remove all original art for one artist and it won't matter.
Right, because it's just already out there, right? It's like it's already been implied enough such that somebody else is inspired
in a
by
legal
it, right?
way, right? Like you are allowed to do fan art and you are allowed to do things in the style of Van Gogh by hand. And so I just think a lot of these issues are going to be perhaps they may play out a little bit differently from what people think. That's obviously very different from, hey, what's happening with the New York Times article or whatever, and is it being copied verbatim or not? And there's nuances around that as well because of the metadata that's being exposed on some of these websites. But I think at least on the image gen side, it's a little bit trickier, I think, than people think. And it may also be harder to protect certain artists because there's already so much derivative art.
Yeah, it does seem, I agree with you. The New York Times thing is different in that it's very clear when the output of this thing is verbatim to the content it was trained on. However, as you said, with images, video, other forms of media, it's going to be a lot more complicated. And it does seem like, there is starting to be a discussion in DC about the legality of training. Obviously, none of us work in DC, but like, how do you two see this thing playing out? I mean, theoretically, it kind of makes sense to me that training would be fine because that's how humans learn, right? We read, we get inspired, we create. Why should machines be any different? But it does seem like this conversation is starting to happen. How do you think it's going to play out?
It's a political question, so it depends on who's in office as well. But I think there's already like a strong case for fair use, assuming that there's a set of safeguards around what model outputs look like. And I think people will go actually fight these battles at the application layer and at the sort of proven output capability layer. And I think that's the right place for it. I do think, going back to what Elad said, there are like one of the other core use cases for blockchain-based technologies is enabling microtransactions cheaply, right? And there's still work to be done here, but I think one of the things that Ilya said that still really resonates with me is a blocker at some point to continued progress in model training is collecting data we don't have yet and getting people to contribute to that, and having systems for those transactions, for labeling and contribution of data that is resistant to abuse, which sounds like an identity and reputation system. I think it's going to be really valuable if it can be figured out.
Elad, Sarah, this has been awesome. If people want to find out more about the podcast, No Priors, where can they find it?
no-priors.com, or you can search for it. You can Perplexity for it.
Anything else either of you want to plug?
No, it's a great conversation.
I really appreciate the time today.
Cool. This has been awesome. Thank you both so much. Thanks for listening to Generative Now. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review the episode. That really does help. And if you want to learn more, follow Lightspeed at Lightspeed VP on YouTube, X, LinkedIn, and everywhere else. Generative Now is produced by Lightspeed in partnership with Pod People. I am Michael Mignano, and we will be back next week with another awesome conversation. Thanks so much.